I knew something was wrong the morning I found Gloria Campbell standing at the edge of my driveway with a professional camera pointed at my front yard. The sun had barely cracked the horizon over Scottsdale, Arizona, and there she was, snapping pictures like she worked for Architectural Digest. Except Gloria wasn't a photographer. She was the vice president of the Desert Rose Hills Homeowners Association, and she had made it her personal mission to make my life miserable from the day I moved in. My name is Jason Ortiz, and I had purchased my 3-bedroom ranch house in this particular subdivision about 8 months ago. The house was beautiful, the price was right, and the neighborhood seemed quiet enough. What the real estate agent failed to mention was that the HOA was run by a group of retired busybodies who treated the community covenants like they were biblical law, and Gloria Campbell was their high priestess. That first morning, I caught her photographing my property. I was still in my pajamas, coffee cup in hand, staring out my kitchen window in disbelief. She wore her typical uniform, khaki capris, a white polo shirt with the Desert Rose Hills logo embroidered on the chest, and a sun visor that did nothing to hide her severely highlighted blonde hair. She moved methodically along my property line, stopping every few feet to take another picture. I opened my front door and stepped onto the porch. "Can I help you with something, Gloria?" She lowered the camera and gave me that tight-lipped smile that never reached her eyes. "Just documenting potential violations, Jason. It's my duty as an HOA board member." "Violations? My yard looks fine. Your grass is a 1/4 inch too long in the southwest corner, and that garbage can is visible from the street. Section 12, paragraph 4 of our covenants clearly states that all trash receptacles must be kept out of sight except on collection days." I looked at the garbage can she was referring to. It was tucked beside my garage, barely visible unless you were specifically looking for it. "Today is collection day. The truck comes at 9. It's only 6:30. You put it out too early." I took a long sip of my coffee, counting to 10 in my head. "The guidelines say we can put them out the night before." "The night before ends at midnight, Jason. Technically, you're in violation." This was classic Gloria. She had sent me 3 violation notices in my first month alone, citing issues like a garden hose that was supposedly the wrong shade of green, a welcome mat that allegedly exceeded the maximum allowed thickness, and wind chimes that she claimed violated the noise ordinance, even though they were barely audible. "I'll make a note of it," I said, turning to go back inside. "I'll be monitoring the situation," she called after me. The next morning, she was back. Same position, same camera, same time. I watched her from my bedroom window this time, documenting my property like it was a crime scene. This continued for a week straight. Every single morning at 6:30, Gloria Campbell appeared at the edge of my driveway with her camera. I mentioned it to my neighbor, Derek, a guy in his 40s who worked from home as a software developer. We were standing in his driveway on a Saturday afternoon, and he was washing his car. "Yeah, she did that to me for about 2 months last year," Derek said, spraying soap off his front bumper. "Took pictures of everything. My mailbox, my roof, my landscaping. She was convinced my tree was growing over the property line." "Was it?" "By maybe 2 inches. She made me hire a professional arborist to trim it. Cost me $400. "That's insane. That's Gloria. She's been on the HOA board for 6 years. Nobody runs against her because nobody wants to deal with the meetings and the drama. So she just keeps getting reelected. There's got to be something I can do about her photographing my house every day." Derek shrugged. "You could file a complaint with the HOA board, but she's on the board, so good luck with that. Most people just try to stay off her radar." But I was already on her radar, and she wasn't letting up. By the second week, Gloria had expanded her surveillance routine. She started showing up at different times throughout the day: 7 in the morning, noon, 4 in the afternoon. Sometimes even after dark, using the flash on her camera to illuminate my front yard. I had motion-activated security cameras installed on my property, and they captured every visit. I started saving the footage. The violation notices kept coming. My mailbox post needed repainting. My front door wreath was too large. My solar pathway lights were not the approved style. Each notice came with a threat of fines if I didn't remedy the situation within 14 days. Some of the violations were so absurd that I started researching Arizona HOA law to see if any of this was even legal. That's when I discovered that while HOAs do have broad powers, there are limits. Harassment, for one, was not protected under the community covenants, and what Gloria was doing was starting to feel a lot like harassment. I decided to attend the next HOA board meeting. They were held monthly in the community clubhouse, a beige stucco building near the neighborhood entrance that also housed a small gym and a pool. I'd never been to a meeting before, always finding excuses to skip them, but now I had a reason to be there. The meeting room was set up with folding chairs facing a long table where the 5 board members sat. Gloria was there, of course, sitting in the second seat from the left. The president was a man named Richard Vaughn, a retired accountant in his 70s with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetually bored expression. The other board members were Barbara, Linda, and Tom, all retirees, all friends with Gloria. About 15 residents showed up, most of them older folks who seemed to attend every meeting out of habit rather than necessity. I took a seat in the back row. Richard called the meeting to order and launched into a monotonous recap of the previous month's minutes. Then came the treasurer's report, followed by a discussion about repaving the pool deck. I waited through 45 minutes of tedious procedural talk before Richard finally opened the floor for resident comments. I stood up. "I'd like to address the board about a concern I have," Richard nodded. "State your name and address for the record." "Jason Ortiz, 4782 Desert Bloom Drive. I want to talk about harassment." Gloria's head snapped toward me. "Excuse me? For the past 3 weeks, you've been coming to my property every single day, sometimes multiple times a day to photograph my house. I have security footage documenting at least 40 separate visits. This goes beyond normal HOA enforcement. This is harassment." The room had gone quiet. A few residents turned in their chairs to look at me. Gloria stood up, her face flushing. "I'm doing my job as a board member. If your property wasn't constantly in violation, I wouldn't need to monitor it so closely." "My property is not constantly in violation. You're inventing violations to justify your behavior. Last week you cited me because my garden hose was supposedly visible from the street. I don't even own a garden hose." "I have photographic evidence." "Then show it." She fumbled with her phone, scrolling through what I assumed were hundreds of photos of my house. The other board members looked uncomfortable. Barbara whispered something to Linda. Richard cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should take this offline. Jason, if you have concerns about Gloria's enforcement activities, you can submit a formal complaint to the board." "I'm submitting that complaint right now, verbally, in front of everyone here. What she's doing is not normal. It's obsessive, and it's making me uncomfortable in my own home." Gloria slammed her phone down on the table. "If you followed the rules, we wouldn't have a problem. But ever since you moved in, you've been a constant source of issues. Your grass is too long, your decorations are non-compliant, your vehicle is parked at the wrong angle. My vehicle is parked in my own driveway, at an angle that exceeds 15 degrees from parallel with the curb." Someone in the front row actually laughed. Gloria whipped around to glare at them. Richard held up his hands. "Let's all calm down. Gloria, perhaps you could ease up on the daily monitoring. Jason, please make sure you're reviewing the community covenants so you understand what's expected." It was a diplomatic non-answer that satisfied no one. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, but I barely heard any of it. I was too busy watching Gloria, who kept shooting me hostile looks from across the room. After the meeting, as people filed out, a woman in her 50s approached me. She had short gray hair and kind eyes. "That took guts," she said. "I'm Patricia. I live over on Cactus Ridge Court." "Nice to meet you." "Gloria did something similar to me a few years ago. Made my life hell for about 6 months. She eventually moved on to someone else, but it was awful while it lasted." "How did you deal with it?" Patricia shook her head. "I didn't really. I just kept my head down and made sure everything was perfect. But you're right to call her out. Someone needs to." I left the meeting feeling frustrated but validated. At least I wasn't crazy. Other people had experienced Gloria's wrath, but if I thought confronting her publicly would make her back off, I was wrong. The next morning, she was back at my property, 6:30 on the dot, camera in hand. Only this time, she wasn't just photographing from the street. She had stepped onto my driveway, walking right up to my garage door to take close-up shots of some non-existent violation. I threw open my front door. "Get off my property!" She didn't even flinch. "The driveway is part of the common area as defined by the plat map." "No, it's not. The property line is clearly marked. You're trespassing." "I'm performing my duties as an HOA board member." "Your duties don't include trespassing. Leave now, or I'm calling the police." She finally lowered the camera, her expression cold. "You made a big mistake last night, Jason. You embarrassed me in front of the entire board. That was very unwise." "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact. You want to play games? Fine, but you're not going to win." She turned and walked away, leaving me standing on my porch with my heart pounding. This had escalated beyond petty HOA disputes. Gloria was making this personal. Over the next few days, the situation deteriorated. Gloria's morning visits continued, but now she was also sending me multiple violation notices per day via certified mail. My doorbell camera captured her walking up to my front door at odd hours to leave notices tucked into the frame. She cited me for things that didn't exist: a crack in my driveway that wasn't there, a stain on my roof that was just a shadow, landscaping that supposedly violated setback requirements, even though it had been professionally installed by the previous owner. Each notice came with escalating fine amounts: $50, $100, $200. The notices stated that if I didn't pay within 30 days, the HOA could place a lien on my property. I contacted a real estate attorney named Susan Rodriguez, who specialized in HOA disputes. Her office was in downtown Scottsdale, a sleek modern building with floor-to-ceiling windows. Susan was in her 40s, sharply dressed, and she listened to my story without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. "How much footage do you have?" "Hours. Every single visit is documented on my security cameras going back 3 weeks." "And you have copies of all the violation notices?" "Everyone," Susan nodded. "What Gloria is doing could constitute harassment under Arizona law. The fact that she's escalating after you confronted her publicly shows a pattern of retaliation. We could potentially file a civil suit against both her and the HOA." "What would that accomplish?" "At minimum, we could get a restraining order to keep her away from your property. We could also seek damages for emotional distress and potentially have her removed from the board. But I'll be honest with you, Jason. These cases can get expensive and time-consuming. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about Gloria's face when she told me I'd made a mistake. I thought about waking up every morning to find her photographing my house like I was a criminal. I thought about the stack of violation notices piling up on my kitchen counter. "I'm prepared," I said. Susan drafted a formal cease and desist letter that afternoon. It outlined Gloria's pattern of behavior, cited specific Arizona statutes regarding harassment and trespassing, and demanded that she immediately stop her surveillance activities and withdraw all pending violation notices. We sent it via certified mail and email. Gloria's response came 2 days later, not to me, but in the form of an official HOA letter signed by all 5 board members. The letter stated that the board had reviewed my complaints and found them to be without merit. Gloria Campbell was performing her duties as assigned, and any enforcement actions taken were consistent with the community covenants. Furthermore, the letter stated that if I continued to interfere with board members' official duties, the HOA would take legal action against me. Susan read the letter and shook her head. "They're circling the wagons. This is what happens when board members are all friends. They protect each other instead of doing what's right." "So what's our next move?" "We file suit. Based on what you've told me and the evidence you have, I think we have a strong case for harassment and possibly stalking. We'll name Gloria as the primary defendant and include the HOA as a defendant for enabling her behavior." "Stalking? Isn't that a criminal charge?" "It can be, but we're pursuing this civilly. However, depending on what we uncover, there could be grounds for criminal charges as well." We filed the lawsuit in Maricopa County Superior Court 3 weeks later. The complaint detailed Gloria's actions, included timestamps from my security footage, and copies of the excessive violation notices. We sought an injunction to keep Gloria at least 500 feet away from my property, compensatory damages for emotional distress, and punitive damages to deter similar conduct in the future. The HOA hired a law firm out of Phoenix to represent them. Their initial response was predictable: a motion to dismiss, arguing that Gloria's actions were protected under the HOA's authority to enforce covenants. Our attorney filed a response arguing that no HOA covenant granted board members the right to harass residents or trespass on their property. The judge, a woman named Margaret Sorensen, denied the motion to dismiss and set a hearing date for the injunction request. That hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out, which meant 6 more weeks of dealing with Gloria's surveillance. But something changed after the lawsuit was filed. Gloria stopped showing up every morning. At first, I thought maybe her attorneys had advised her to cool it. Then I realized she hadn't stopped. She'd just gotten sneakier. My security cameras caught her driving by slowly at various times, sometimes parking down the street where she could still see my house. She wasn't getting out of her car anymore, but the surveillance continued. I documented everything and sent updates to Susan. "This actually helps our case," Susan said during one of our phone calls. "It shows she's aware her behavior is inappropriate but can't help herself. That speaks to the level of obsession we're alleging." The weeks leading up to the hearing were tense. I started to feel paranoid, always wondering if Gloria was watching. I found myself closing my curtains during the day, something I never used to do. I stopped spending time in my front yard. The stress was affecting my work. I was a project manager for a construction company, and I found it hard to concentrate during meetings. Derek checked in on me one evening, bringing over a 6-pack of beer. We sat in my backyard, which at least offered some privacy from the street. "You're doing the right thing," he said. "Even if it's hard. Gloria needs to be stopped." "I just want to live in my house in peace. Is that too much to ask?" "Not at all, man. The HOA was created to maintain property values and handle common areas, not to terrorize people. Gloria has forgotten that." "Has she been bothering you lately?" Derek shook his head. "No, but I think it's because she's so focused on you. Once this is over, she'll probably move on to someone else. Unless we actually stop her." The hearing finally arrived on a Tuesday morning in early October. The courthouse was downtown, a sprawling complex of buildings that always seemed busy no matter what time of day. Susan met me outside, looking confident in a navy suit. "Ready?" she asked. "As ready as I'll ever be." The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with just a few rows of benches for observers. Gloria was already there with the HOA's attorneys, 3 lawyers in expensive suits who looked like they charged by the minute. Gloria wore a modest dress and had toned down her usual aggressive styling. She was clearly trying to look sympathetic. Judge Sorensen took the bench promptly at 9. She was in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a bun, and she had the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who had heard every excuse in the book. "This is a hearing on the plaintiff's request for a preliminary injunction," she said. "Ms. Rodriguez, you may proceed." Susan stood and presented our case methodically. She introduced the security footage, showing a compilation of Gloria's visits to my property. The video was damning. It showed her coming by day after day, sometimes multiple times a day, always with her camera. It showed her stepping onto my driveway, walking up to my garage, peering into my windows. The timestamps proved the frequency and obsessive nature of her behavior. Susan also introduced the violation notices, laying them out in chronological order. She pointed out how the violations increased in both frequency and absurdity after I had confronted Gloria at the HOA meeting. She presented expert testimony from a psychologist who had reviewed the evidence and concluded that Gloria's behavior fit the pattern of obsessive harassment. The HOA's attorneys tried to argue that Gloria was simply doing her job. They presented the community covenants and argued that board members had broad authority to inspect properties and enforce rules. They characterized Gloria as a dedicated volunteer who was being unfairly targeted for trying to maintain community standards. But when Judge Sorensen asked them to explain why Gloria needed to visit my property 47 times in 3 weeks, they didn't have a good answer. When she asked them to justify some of the more ridiculous violation notices, like the one about my non-existent garden hose, they fumbled. The judge called a recess and returned 30 minutes later with her decision. "I've reviewed the evidence presented by both sides," she said. "While HOA board members do have authority to enforce community covenants, that authority is not unlimited. The frequency and nature of Ms. Campbell's visits to Mr. Ortiz's property exceed any reasonable definition of enforcement activity. The video evidence shows behavior that is obsessive and intrusive. Furthermore, the pattern of escalating violation notices following Mr. Ortiz's complaint at the HOA meeting suggests retaliatory intent. Gloria's face went pale. Breathe. Therefore, I am granting the plaintiff's request for a preliminary injunction. Gloria Campbell is hereby ordered to stay at least 500 feet away from Jason Ortiz's property unless she has a legitimate, documented reason to be there and has provided advance written notice. She is also prohibited from any form of direct or indirect contact with Mr. Ortiz except through attorneys. Any violation of this order will result in contempt charges. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. 500 feet. That meant Gloria couldn't even drive down my street without violating the order. The judge continued. Additionally, I am ordering the Desert Rose Hills HOA to conduct a full review of all violation notices issued to Mr. Ortiz within the past year. Any notices found to be without merit must be withdrawn, and any associated fines must be refunded. The HOA attorneys looked like they wanted to object, but the judge's expression made it clear she was done hearing arguments. This matter will proceed to trial on the underlying harassment claims, Judge Sorensen said, but in the meantime, this injunction is in full effect. Ms. Campbell, do you understand these terms? Gloria stood, her voice barely audible. Yes, Your Honor. We left the courthouse feeling victorious. Susan was pleased with the outcome. That's about as good as we could have hoped for at this stage, she said. Now we prepare for trial. If the evidence holds up, and I believe it will, we should be able to secure a permanent injunction and significant damages. I drove home feeling lighter than I had in months. No more waking up to find Gloria photographing my property. No more dreading the daily mail delivery. No more feeling like a prisoner in my own home. For the next few weeks, life returned to something resembling normal. I started opening my curtains again. I spent time in my front yard on weekends, working on my landscaping without looking over my shoulder. The HOA conducted its review and withdrew 12 of the 15 violation notices they had issued me, refunding nearly $800 in fines. But Gloria wasn't taking her defeat gracefully. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she was furious about the injunction. Derek told me she had started attending HOA meetings with a lawyer present, paranoid that someone else might file a complaint against her. Patricia, the woman who had approached me after that first meeting, said Gloria had started targeting other residents with increased scrutiny, as if trying to prove she was just doing her job. Then, about a month after the injunction was issued, something strange happened. I came home from work one evening to find police cars parked in front of Gloria's house. She lived 4 streets over, well outside the 500-foot buffer. I slowed down as I drove past, trying to see what was going on, but the officers were inside the house. I texted Derek. "Do you know what's happening at Gloria Campbell's place?" He responded a few minutes later. "No idea, but there are cops everywhere. I'll see what I can find out." The next morning, Derek knocked on my door. He looked excited. "Dude, you're not going to believe this. Gloria got arrested last night." "For what?" "Stalking, but not you. Apparently she's been doing the same thing to someone else in the neighborhood. A guy named Paul Martinez who lives over on Saguaro Way. He filed a police report weeks ago and they've been investigating. Last night they arrested her." I felt a chill run down my spine. She was doing this to someone else at the same time? Looks like it. Paul's situation was even worse than yours from what I heard. She was following him to work, showing up at his office, calling his employer with complaints. The guy was terrified. This changed everything. If Gloria had been harassing multiple people simultaneously, it wasn't just overzealous HOA enforcement, it was a pattern of criminal behavior. I called Susan immediately and filled her in. She was quiet for a moment after I finished. "This is significant," she said. "If Gloria has been arrested on stalking charges, it completely undermines the HOA's argument that she was just doing her job. It shows this is about her personality and behavior, not about enforcing covenants." "What does this mean for our case?" "It strengthens it considerably. We can use the criminal charges as evidence of her pattern of harassment, and if she's convicted, that will make our civil case much easier to win." Over the next few days, more information came out. Paul Martinez had indeed filed multiple police reports about Gloria's behavior. She had been showing up at his workplace, a dental office where he worked as an office manager, and making scenes in the parking lot. She had called his boss claiming Paul was embezzling HOA funds, which was completely false and resulted in an internal investigation that cleared him but damaged his reputation. She had followed him to his gym, his grocery store, and even to his children's school. The police had been building a case against her for weeks before making the arrest. They had interviewed witnesses, collected video evidence, and documented her escalating behavior. The stalking charge was serious, carrying potential jail time if convicted. The HOA board held an emergency meeting. I didn't attend, but Patricia did, and she filled me in afterward. They voted to suspend Gloria from the board pending the outcome of the criminal case, Patricia said. Richard tried to defend her at first, but the attorney they had there advised them they needed to distance themselves from her, especially with your lawsuit still pending. How did Gloria react? She wasn't there. Her lawyer was there representing her, and he tried to argue that she was innocent until proven guilty, but the board wasn't having it. They suspended her effective immediately. It felt surreal. Just a few months ago, Gloria had been an untouchable figure in the neighborhood, wielding her HOA authority like a weapon. Now she was suspended from the board and facing criminal charges. The trial date for the criminal stalking case was set for January, about 3 months away. Our civil trial was scheduled for February, meaning we would know the outcome of the criminal case before proceeding with our lawsuit. Susan said this was ideal timing. If she's convicted, and I think she will be based on what you've told me, it will make our civil case a slam dunk, she said. In the meantime, I tried to move on with my life. The holidays approached, and I decorated my house for Christmas, making sure everything complied with the HOA guidelines. Not because I was afraid of Gloria anymore, but because I didn't want to give the board any legitimate reasons to cite me. Richard Vaughn had taken over Gloria's enforcement duties, and he was far more reasonable. He conducted one inspection of my property in November, found everything in compliance, and that was it. The neighborhood started to feel different too. With Gloria suspended, people seemed more relaxed. I noticed more holiday decorations going up, more kids playing in the streets, more neighbors actually talking to each other instead of hurrying inside. It was like a collective exhale. Derek and I started playing basketball at the community court on Saturday mornings. A few other guys from the neighborhood joined us, and it became a regular thing. One of them was Paul Martinez, the other man Gloria had been stalking. He was in his late 30s, soft-spoken, with the wary demeanor of someone who had been through trauma. After one of our games, Paul and I talked while the others headed home. I heard you had your own issues with Gloria, he said. Yeah, not as bad as what you went through, though. Paul shook his head. It was a nightmare. She completely fixated on me after I questioned one of her decisions at an HOA meeting. It was like she couldn't let it go. The more I tried to avoid her, the worse she got. I'm sorry you went through that. I'm just glad she's finally being held accountable. For a while there, I thought I was losing my mind. Everyone kept telling me to just ignore her, but you can't ignore someone who shows up everywhere you go. Are you going to file a civil suit? My lawyer's advising me to wait until after the criminal trial. If she's convicted, it makes the civil case much easier. We stood there in the desert morning sun, two guys who had been terrorized by the same person, both waiting for justice. The criminal trial began in mid-January. I attended as a spectator, sitting in the back of the courtroom along with several other residents from our neighborhood. The prosecution presented their case methodically, calling Paul to testify about Gloria's behavior. He described coming out of his office to find her sitting in her car, watching. He described the phone calls to his employer, the confrontations in parking lots, the messages left on his doorstep. The prosecution also called his co-workers, who testified about Gloria showing up at the dental office and causing disturbances. They called his wife, who testified about how the stress had affected their family. And they presented security footage, just like we had, showing Gloria's car following Paul to various locations around Scottsdale. Gloria's defense attorney tried to argue that she had legitimate concerns about HOA business and was trying to address them with Paul, who had been the HOA treasurer before resigning in frustration. But the evidence was overwhelming. The frequency of her contacts, the nature of her accusations, and the fact that she had continued even after Paul resigned from the board all pointed to stalking rather than legitimate HOA business. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found Gloria Campbell guilty of stalking, a Class 5 felony in Arizona. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. Gloria sat motionless, her face blank. The judge scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later, but allowed her to remain free on bond in the meantime. When sentencing day arrived, the courtroom was packed. Paul Martinez gave a victim impact statement describing how Gloria's behavior had affected his mental health, his job performance, and his family relationships. He talked about the anxiety of never knowing when she would show up next, the humiliation of having his employer question his integrity, and the fear that she might escalate to violence. The judge listened carefully and then addressed Gloria directly. "Ms. Campbell, you held a position of trust in your community. You were elected to serve your neighbors, to help maintain property values and community standards. Instead, you abused that position to terrorize people who disagreed with you. You turned what should have been a service role into a weapon of harassment. The evidence showed a pattern of obsessive, intrusive behavior that went far beyond any reasonable interpretation of your duties." Gloria stared straight ahead, her jaw tight. "I am sentencing you to 18 months in prison with credit for time served. However, I am suspending all but 90 days of that sentence, meaning you will serve 90 days in county jail. Following your release, you will be on probation for 3 years. The terms of your probation include mandatory mental health counseling, community service, and a permanent prohibition from serving on any HOA board. You will also maintain no contact orders with both Paul Martinez and Jason Ortiz. If you violate any terms of your probation, you will serve the remainder of your sentence. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor," Gloria said quietly. She was taken into custody immediately. I watched as the bailiff led her out of the courtroom in handcuffs. Part of me felt vindicated. This was the person who had made my life miserable, who had violated my privacy and peace of mind. But another part of me just felt sad. Gloria had thrown away her reputation and her freedom because she couldn't control her need to dominate others. Our civil trial was scheduled for late February, but with Gloria's conviction, the HOA's attorneys reached out to Susan about settling. They knew they had no chance of winning now. The criminal conviction proved everything we had been alleging in our civil suit. The settlement negotiations took about 2 weeks. The HOA agreed to pay me $75,000 in damages to permanently revoke all violation notices Gloria had issued me and to implement new policies regarding board member conduct and oversight. They also agreed to pay Paul Martinez a separate settlement amount, the details of which remained confidential. Part of the settlement included Gloria being permanently banned from the Desert Rose Hills property. Even after she served her 90 days and was released, she would not be allowed to return to the neighborhood. She would have to sell her house and move elsewhere. The HOA also agreed to hire a professional management company to handle covenant enforcement, removing that responsibility from volunteer board members. It was a change that should have been made years ago. I deposited the settlement check in early March, almost exactly 1 year after I had first moved into the neighborhood. It felt surreal to think about everything that had happened in those 12 months. I'd bought what I thought would be my dream home, only to be terrorized by an HOA board member with control issues. I'd been forced to hire lawyers, file lawsuits, and spend months looking over my shoulder. But I had also learned something important. Standing up to bullies matters, even when it's hard. If I'd just kept my head down and accepted Gloria's harassment, she would have continued terrorizing me and others. By fighting back, by documenting everything and pursuing legal action, I'd not only protected myself, but helped change things for the entire neighborhood. Gloria served her 90 days at the Maricopa County Jail and was released in April. True to the settlement agreement, she put her house on the market immediately. Derek told me she had moved in with her sister somewhere in Tempe. I never saw her again. The Desert Rose Hills HOA underwent significant changes after Gloria's conviction. Richard Vaughn resigned as president, saying he was too old for all the drama. The board held special elections and brought in new members, including Patricia, the woman who had first encouraged me to stand up to Gloria. The new board implemented transparency policies, regular audits of enforcement actions, and a formal appeal process for residents who felt they had been unfairly cited. The professional management company they hired was efficient and fair. They conducted property inspections on a regular schedule, issued violations only when truly warranted, and worked with homeowners to resolve issues rather than immediately threatening fines. It was how an HOA was supposed to operate. Paul Martinez and I became friends through the whole ordeal. Our families started getting together for barbecues, and our kids became playmates. We both understood what the other had been through in a way no one else really could. Sometimes we would joke about writing a book called Surviving HOA Hell, but mostly we just tried to move forward. I invested some of the settlement money in upgrading my house, new landscaping, a renovated kitchen, a deck in the backyard. I wanted to make the place truly feel like home, not just the battleground it had become during the Gloria era. Each improvement felt like reclaiming my space, making it mine again. The neighborhood itself started to thrive in Gloria's absence. Property values actually went up, which was ironic given that she had always claimed she was protecting those values. People were happier, more willing to invest in their homes when they didn't fear arbitrary enforcement actions. The community events that the HOA sponsored, like the summer pool party and the fall festival, had better attendance. It turned out that people wanted to participate when they didn't feel like they were under surveillance. Derek and I were sitting on my new deck one evening in June, about a year and a half after the whole thing started. We were drinking beer and watching the sunset paint the desert sky in shades of orange and purple. "You ever regret buying here?" Derek asked. I thought about it for a moment. At the height of everything with Gloria, yeah, I regretted it almost daily. But now, no, this is home. And honestly, going through all that taught me something. What's that? That you can't let bullies win. Whether it's someone at work or school or in your neighborhood, you have to stand up. It won't always be easy, and it might get worse before it gets better, but it's worth it. Derek clinked his beer bottle against mine. Amen to that. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sky darken. Somewhere in the distance, kids were laughing as they rode their bikes through the neighborhood. A dog barked, someone was grilling dinner, and the smell of mesquite smoke drifted on the warm air. This was what I had wanted when I bought the house: peace, community, a place to build a life. It had taken longer to achieve than I'd expected, and the path had been much harder than it should have been. But sitting there on my deck, in my home, in my neighborhood, I finally felt like I had won. The legal system had worked the way it was supposed to. The injunction kept Gloria away from my property, giving me the breathing room I needed. The criminal prosecution held her accountable for her actions. The civil settlement compensated me for what I had endured and forced the HOA to make changes that would protect future residents. But more than any of that, I had learned that documentation matters. Those security cameras had been the key to everything. Without video evidence of Gloria's daily visits, without timestamps proving the obsessive frequency of her surveillance, it would have been her word against mine. The cameras didn't lie. They captured every intrusion, every trespass, every moment of harassment. I had also learned that lawyers who specialize in HOA disputes are worth their weight in gold. Susan Rodriguez had known exactly how to frame the case, which laws applied, and how to present evidence effectively. She had turned my anger and frustration into a coherent legal strategy that actually worked, and I had learned that community matters. When I spoke up at that HOA meeting, I felt alone. But afterward, people like Patricia and Paul and Derek reached out, sharing their own stories, offering support. I wasn't the only one who had suffered under Gloria's regime. By fighting back, I had given others permission to speak up too. The 500-foot buffer that the judge had imposed on Gloria became something of a legend in the neighborhood. People would joke about it. "Don't mess with Jason or you'll get the 500-foot treatment." It was funny, but it also served as a reminder that there were limits to HOA authority, that board members couldn't do whatever they wanted without consequences. I stayed in touch with Susan Rodriguez, and she told me that my case had become something she referenced when consulting with other clients facing similar situations. The combination of the civil injunction and the criminal stalking conviction had set a precedent that was useful in other HOA harassment cases. You helped establish that HOA board members don't have immunity to harass residents, she told me during one of our follow-up calls. That's important. Too many people think they have no recourse against their HOA, but cases like yours show that's not true. By the time the second anniversary of my move-in date rolled around, life had settled into a comfortable rhythm. I had a good job, a beautiful home, great neighbors, and a functional HOA that actually served the community rather than terrorizing it. The whole experience with Gloria felt like a bad dream, something that had happened to someone else. But I never took down the security cameras. They stayed in place, silently recording, just in case, because I had learned that in HOA disputes, like in life, it's always better to have evidence you don't need than to need evidence you don't have. Paul Martinez's criminal case had ripple effects beyond just our neighborhood. A local news station picked up the story, running a segment about HOA abuse and how residents could protect themselves. The story featured interviews with Paul and me, and it sparked a broader conversation about HOA oversight in Arizona. Some state legislators even proposed new laws that would create an ombudsman office for HOA disputes and strengthen protections for homeowners. The bills didn't pass that session, but the conversation had started. Change was coming, slowly but surely. Gloria's house finally sold in August, almost 4 months after she had listed it. The new owners were a young couple with a baby, and they were thrilled to move into the neighborhood. I introduced myself and gave them a brief sanitized version of the neighborhood history. They had heard rumors about the previous owner, but didn't know the details. "Everyone we've talked to says the HOA is great now," the husband said. "That's one of the reasons we bought here." I smiled. It is great now. Took some work to get there, but it was worth it. They settled in quickly, and the neighborhood welcomed them. There was a sense of renewal in Desert Rose Hills, a feeling that we had collectively survived something toxic and come out stronger. The HOA board continued to function well under its new leadership. Patricia turned out to be an excellent board member, focused on transparency and fairness. The professional management company handled the day-to-day enforcement issues with efficiency and without drama. Violation notices were rare and always justified. I even attended HOA meetings regularly now, not because I had to, but because I wanted to stay informed and involved. The meetings were boring in the best possible way. Discussions about landscaping maintenance, pool schedules, and budget line items. No drama, no harassment, no Karen with a camera stalking residents. Yes, Derek and I started a neighborhood watch program, which was ironic given that the biggest threat to the neighborhood had come from within the HOA itself. But it gave us a chance to build community connections and look out for each other. We had monthly meetings at the clubhouse, and they were always well attended. One evening at a neighborhood watch meeting, a newer resident named Tom Chen raised a question. "I've heard stories about what happened with the previous board member," he said carefully. "Is there anything we should be watching out for to make sure that doesn't happen again?" It was a fair question. I glanced at Patricia, who nodded at me to take it. Painful. "The best protection is documentation and communication," I said. "If you ever feel like you're being unfairly targeted by the HOA, document everything. Save emails, take photos, install security cameras if needed, and talk to your neighbors. Don't suffer in silence. That's how people like Gloria get away with their behavior for so long." "Also," Patricia added, "attend HOA meetings, hold the board accountable, ask questions. We work for you, not the other way around. If we ever forget that, you need to remind us." There were nods around the room. These were people who had learned the hard way what could happen when an HOA went wrong. They weren't going to let it happen again. As the months passed, the whole situation faded further into the past. New residents moved in who had never heard of Gloria Campbell. Kids grew up knowing nothing about the drama that had once consumed the neighborhood. Life moved on, as it always does. But I never forgot. Every time I pulled into my driveway, I remembered those mornings when Gloria stood there with her camera. Every time I checked my mail, I remembered the stack of violation notices. Every time I sat on my deck looking at my landscaping, I remembered fighting for the right to enjoy my own property in peace. The experience had changed me in subtle ways. I was more aware of contracts and bylaws now, always reading the fine print. I was more willing to speak up when I saw injustice, even when it was uncomfortable. And I was more appreciative of the simple pleasure of living in a home where I felt safe and welcome. The 500-foot buffer that Judge Sorensen had imposed remained in effect permanently. Even after Gloria completed her probation, even after years had passed, she was legally required to stay 500 feet away from my property. It was a lasting consequence of her actions, a reminder that harassment has real penalties. I never heard directly from Gloria again. She never apologized, never reached out, never acknowledged the harm she had caused. Maybe she believed she had been in the right all along. Maybe she couldn't admit, even to herself, that she had crossed so many lines. Or maybe she was too ashamed to face what she had done. I didn't need an apology from her. The legal victories, both criminal and civil, were validation enough. The changes in the HOA, the improvements in the neighborhood, the friendships I had built through the ordeal, those were what mattered. Years later, I would sometimes tell the story to friends or colleagues who complained about their own HOAs. The reactions were always the same: shock at what Gloria had done, admiration that I had fought back, and questions about how to handle their own situations. My advice was always consistent: document everything, know your rights, don't be afraid to get legal help, and remember that HOA board members are not above the law. They have authority, but that authority has limits. When those limits are exceeded, the legal system provides remedies. You just have to be willing to use them. The settlement money helped, of course. It allowed me to make improvements to my property that I might otherwise have delayed. But more than the money, it was the principle. It was standing up and saying that Gloria's behavior was wrong and unacceptable. It was refusing to be bullied in my own home. It was fighting for justice, not just for myself, but for Paul Martinez and for anyone else who might have become Gloria's victim if she hadn't been stopped. Looking back, I could trace a clear line from that first morning when I saw her photographing my property to the day Judge Sorensen imposed the 500-foot buffer. Every step along the way had been necessary. Confronting her at the HOA meeting had been necessary to establish that I wasn't going to be a passive victim. Hiring Susan Rodriguez had been necessary to navigate the legal system. Filing the lawsuit had been necessary to force accountability. Attending the criminal trial had been necessary to see justice served. None of it had been easy. There were times when I wondered if it was worth the stress, the expense, the time commitment. There were nights when I lay awake worrying about what Gloria might do next, whether she might escalate to something dangerous. There were moments when I seriously considered just selling the house and moving somewhere else, but I had stuck it out, and I was glad I did. The house was mine. The neighborhood was better. Gloria was gone, legally barred from returning, and I had learned that I was stronger than I had realized, capable of fighting battles I never imagined I would have to fight. As I sat on my deck on a warm summer evening, 3 years after the whole ordeal had begun, I raised my beer to the empty chair beside me where Derek usually sat. He was out of town visiting family, but he'd be back next week for our regular Saturday basketball game. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant colors. My landscaping looked beautiful, professionally maintained by the service I had hired with part of the settlement money. My house was exactly the way I wanted it, every improvement made on my timeline, according to my preferences, without fear of arbitrary violation notices. This was home. This was peace. This was what I had fought for. And 500 feet away, in every direction from my property line, was a buffer zone that Gloria Campbell could never cross, a permanent reminder that justice, though sometimes slow, eventually prevails. A boundary that said clearly, this far and no further. I had won, not just the legal case, but something more important. I had won the right to live in my home without fear, without surveillance, without harassment. I had won my peace of mind back. That victory, more than any settlement check or court order, was what mattered most, and it was a victory I would never take for granted again.